The International Finance Corporation has released a new report on Nigeria's private sector titled Creating Markets in Nigeria, Country Private Sector Diagnostics. The report argues that Nigeria is uniquely positioned for strong economic growth and should focus on a wider private sector-led growth strategy to leverage its considerable factor endowments and seize market opportunities. Joining us to discuss further from our Abuja studio is Dr. Volker Treichel, Regional Economist for the International Finance Corporation. Dr. Treichel, thank you so much for joining us. Can you talk us through the rationale for this report?
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting us to discuss this important report that we just released. It is a report that is jointly prepared by the World Bank and by the IFC, by the International Finance Corporation. And at the core, really, of the report is the question, how can the private sector come to the center of the growth strategy in Nigeria? What are really the sectors that can drive growth going forward? And what are the constraints that are hindering growth, both in the cross-cutting way, but also at the sectoral level? And why is this question so important? The CPSDs have now been prepared in about 72 countries all around the world. Nigeria being one of them. And the reason why they were initiated a few years ago is because the international community came to a realization that fiscal space in almost all countries is constrained. Now so constrained that to meet the SDGs, the MDGs, is something that will require a much greater role of the private sector going forward. And therefore, a systematic review of how that can actually take place at the country level was considered necessary. Now, this, of course, preceded the pandemic. We are now a year and a half into the pandemic, and the case for a greater role of the private sector is even larger now, because fiscal space in Nigeria and most other countries is now even more severely constrained than it was before the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. Now, as far as growth drivers, the report gets in depth there. Could you help us out and tell us about those growth drivers going forward?
Yeah, so we think that four sectors are uniquely positioned in Nigeria to drive growth through the private sector. One is agriculture, agribusiness. Other one is mining. The third one is manufacturing. And the fourth one is the digital economy. And we are not only looking at the headlines here, we are also looking at the subsectors. For example, in the area of agriculture, agribusiness, there's the question of cassava, of citrus, of sesame, of cocoa, of palm oil. And all of these sectors, these subsectors, have considerable opportunities, not only for primary processing, but also down the value chain. If you look at cassava, cassava has major potential for production, for example, alcohol and other derivative products. And the question is, what really can be done at the sectoral level in order to harness the growth potential for all of these sectors? And let me just give you a few examples of the kind of reforms that we're discussing at the sectoral level. In the agriculture area is, if you look at the community block farming, we are mentioning, for example, one firm that has been recently very successful, Alluvial, which has ambitious goals and which is being very effective in bringing community block farming to a much higher level of efficiency. There is another reform, if you look at leather, right, which has so much potential in the north, in Kaduna and in Kano, right? How can we formalize the raw leather producers? Because when we formalize the raw leather producers, we will have greater opportunities for them to access finance and to become more efficient and more productive. That's the second one. Perhaps the third one and most important one in the immediate future is the question of leasing. Leasing has tremendous potential in Nigeria as a lever to increase productivity. Miners and farmers generally do not have the resources to access sophisticated equipment. If you make leasing more available to them, they will have greater opportunities to access these instruments. In mining and in agriculture, this has been proven to be successful. It can be scaled up. And by scaling it up, you have a greater chance for sectoral growth in these subsectors.
Excellent. Thank you so much for going in depth, and thank you for being specific with those sectors. Now, those are the growth drivers. That's the positive side. What about the key cross-cutting constraints for private sector-led growth?
Yeah, thank you. We are, of course, not only looking at the subsectoral specific constraints, but also at the overall cross-cutting constraints. Those that, and many of them are well known. They have been discussed in many different fora. There is a tremendous need to develop an overall macroeconomic framework that is conducive to growth, and that includes the question of how can we mobilize greater internally generated revenue to create a greater fiscal space. It includes the question, how can trade policy be an instrument of growth going forward? What can be done about how can access to finance be enhanced, particularly for SMEs? And here there are many opportunities, right, to improve access to finance for SMEs in a variety of ways. There's also, for example, the coverage of credit bureaus can be extended to the non-traditional credit providers. These are some things that are being discussed in the report. Perhaps the more important one is the question of infrastructure deficiencies, right? Power sector, logistics sector, all areas in which there are major deficiencies, and there are very large holistic reform programs in place that actually are used, that try to address the fundamental constraints in these areas. And in the report, we also identify some very specific reforms that could be undertaken in order to get some quick wins. Let me just give an example. In the power sector, for example, we are looking at the question of off-grid, right? What can be done to improve access to off-grid solutions? And here, for example, one of the suggestions, right, for discussion is the question is of import duties, right, for equipment that is used by off-grid producers. So that's one option. The other one is how can we improve the collaboration of discoms with industrial clusters so as to identify the most efficient areas for these off-grid solutions. I'm just giving examples. It's not possible to go through the entire report. But the idea here is, yes, there are these very large holistic reform programs, and within those, there are some very specific measures that can be undertaken in a variety of ways in order to harness growth going forward. Just another example, for example, is the area of land, which has been an ongoing area of debate in Nigeria and every other African country. And here, for example, the question is, can we find solutions in the short term through the land acquisition and resettlement framework, or the framework for responsible and inclusive land-intensive agriculture? Is it just one of the examples?
Fantastic. Dr. Treichel, what I liked about the report is that it was very specific, and these are very practical reforms that can be, implemented almost immediately. Do you have confidence that despite the impact of the pandemic, Nigeria can see results from what you've put in this report?
I have no doubt that Nigeria has that potential and that willingness. If anything, the pandemic has created a greater sense of urgency. It is clear now, not only in Nigeria, but all around the world. And the need to now really empower the private sector to engage in a constructive dialogue with the private sector in order to find out what can be done in the short term to leverage the tremendous growth opportunities in each of these sectors is there, and the willingness is there. And I think we hope very much that this report will be used for that purpose and will be a vehicle and a facilitator of this kind of dialogue.
Dr. Volker Treichel, Regional Economist for the International Finance Corporation, thank you so much for joining us to take us through this very in-depth, very practical report. We appreciate your insights.